could be a percentage or something, but how much of this is there? What percentage of this ecosystem is forested or is hydrophytic or whatever? Availability, accessibility of a habitat component to the consumer, to the animal. And availability is tricky because, you know, you could argue that the whole world is available to an animal if they can figure out how to get to someplace else. But practically it's not. A white-tailed deer in Tennessee is probably not going to end out in California, much less Africa, right? You know, will a white-tailed deer in Tennessee in Weakley County potentially end out over in Knox County in East Tennessee? Probably not. What about Davidson County, Middle Tennessee? Probably not. Could it end out in Henry County? Probably not, but it could. You know, depends on where it is in Weakley County and how goofy the deer is, right? So availability is tricky, right? It's somewhat subjective. Usage is the quantity of whatever that habitat component is that a consumer, the animal use in a fixed period of time. So habitat use is sometimes compared to habitat availability. And selection is the process in which the consumer, the animal, chooses a particular component. If, let's say you've got a wildlife management area that's got great habitat for deer, and it's surrounded by completely inhospitable habitat, okay, where deer just won't go. And that habitat for deer is 50% forest and 50% field, okay? If that, and that's what's available, all right. If that deer doesn't care where he or she is, forest, field, is all good for me, right? What percentage of its time will it likely spend in the forest?
50.
Yeah, right? It will use habitat in relation to availability. If it prefers forest, it will be in the forest more than 50% of the time, more than it's available, right? And you could make the argument that, well, is it selecting the forest or is it avoiding the field? It's a philosophical argument. You can't really know. Right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that process of selecting. What do animals choose, right? And we have to be careful not to make too much of that, because I can tell you that when my kids were young, after Halloween, if they had a choice between eating dinner or eating the pile of candy in the middle of the living room floor, they're going to eat the candy, even though it wasn't good for them, right? So wildlife, you know, won't necessarily choose usually, or always what's good for them. If they have access to a whole lot of something that's usually limited, and they just have an instinct to get all we can. We have an instinct to eat fats because natural selection says you don't run across fats very often, so get them while you can. And we created a society where we can get all we want, so we go east, right? Preference is a reflection of the likelihood of that component being chosen if offered on an equal basis with all others. So we have to be careful. In wildlife, we often see the concepts of habitat selection and habitat preference being used synonymously. But literally, preference is something that's very difficult to gauge, and we usually don't know. We might say that, you know, based on my study, deer prefer white oak acorns to red oak acorns. But if they had access to all possible available foods, maybe they would prefer Lucky Charms or something that's not out there in the woods. So we can't necessarily know, you know, what ultimate preference always is. So that's why I'm not terribly comfortable using that term a lot of the time, except in one context. Okay, a fellow named Johnson wrote a study in 1980 in which he suggested that we can rank how wildlife associate with habitat in 4 different ways, and he called them the 4 levels of habitat selection. And guys, this has been widely accepted in the wildlife profession, to the point where you'll often hear, like in presentations, when people are talking about habitat, some sort of habitat study, yeah, we were looking at 3rd order habitat selection. And if you ever hear somebody say, we're looking at 3rd order or 4th order or 1st order selection, they're referring to this concept that was developed by Johnson in 1980, okay? So first order selection is the biogeographic range of a species, okay? White-tailed deer, occur, in a good chunk of North America. Not too far north though, right? And not too far south. And why is that the biogeographic range of the species? Because individual animals way up at the very north end of that range, they can make a living, but not very well. So they're not producing very many young. And if those young disperse southward, they're more likely to do okay. If they disperse northward into even more inhospitable habitat, they're less likely to survive or reproduce or have young that survive, right? So that lower survival and lower reproduction keeps them from expanding their range in that direction. And when we go too far south, the same thing. It's too damn hot. The young are dying, So that death or lack of survival or reproduction keeps them from expanding that way. And that's what holds that biogeographic range. So what's going on with a warming climate? Many of the species, their ranges are expanding northward and they're retracting northward. So we're losing those species, those northern species that come down into Appalachians. The biogeographic ranges of those plants and animals is retracting northward because the winters are becoming too warm for them, right? And these species, some of these species down here are slowly working their way northward because now the winters aren't so bad and they can handle it. So that first order habitat selection, the selection isn't changing, but their ranges are changing because of the changing environments, the changing habitat. Kind of cool, right? Okay. Second order selection is where an individual or group chooses to have their home range, a covey of quail or an individual white-tailed deer where, okay? Now that's going to be based partly on territoriality and other things, but they might choose to set up shop where there's some forest and some field and some apple orchard or soybeans or whatever, right? And then third order is use of various habitat components within the home range, patch use. Where's that covey headquarters area? Where are you seeing deer again and again and again on your trail cameras or whatever? And then fourth order selection is very specific, procurement of specific food items, okay? What is that animal eating? Why is it eating the white oak acorns instead of the red oak acorns? It's eating these bugs. It's eating leaves or buds or berries from these species of plants, okay? That's fourth order selection, okay? Good? Know that. You'll see it again. So there's different factors that affect associations at those four different orders, right? What affects biogeographic range? Largely climate. It's not the only thing. The climate's a big influence on the biogeographic range of a species. Within the biogeographic range, often geology, okay? The soil and parent material, because that affects the plants themselves, right? And then the individual home range tends to be land use. You don't have as many deer or turkeys or squirrels in a subdivision or a strip mall as you do, behind my house because I've got more habitat there because of how I've used the land. And then patch use, just distribution of the specific plants that are out there. This animal likes white oak more than red oak or whatever, right? Okay. So we do habitat selection studies. This was my PhD. A lot of my PhD was a habitat selection study. And it involves three steps. First, you figure out what they use. And the way we usually do that these days is with radio telemetry. There's other ways, you observe them or whatever. Next, we figure out what's available to them. And we usually will say, okay, third order or second order habitat availability. Availability within the home range of an animal, or availability within the home range of this population, or something like that, okay? And then statistically compare what's used to what's available to come up with what they're selecting and avoiding, okay? Okay, I'm gonna pass over this in the interest of time to get to this. Imagine this scenario, okay? Here's a wildlife management area that's 1/3 forested, and I'm sorry, not 30% forested and 70% field, okay? And you've got a bear that's got a home range right here, okay? And that home range is 20% forest and 80% field, okay? So we can look at what's available for that bear is 30% forest right there and 70% field. What's used is 20% forest and 80% field. So that right there just describes habitat use, and that in itself is valuable. This bear is using fields 80% of the time. Okay, that's valuable, all right? But when we compare what's available to what's used, we see that use is smaller than availability for forest. We can say that that bear is actually avoiding the forest. And 80% is bigger than the 70% available, so you can say it is selecting the field, okay? And if it was using the field 70% of the time and 70% of its locations, we would say use is equal to availability. It's neither selecting nor avoiding that habitat. But as long as use is bigger or smaller than, we can say it's selecting or avoiding. Okay? Now, does that mean that forests are bad for bears? No. I don't usually like bananas very much, but I know that molybdenum or whatever the heck is good for me. So I eat them, not a whole lot. I don't need too much, just a little is fine. But I really need a little, right? So that little bit of forest might be really important, okay? So use is valuable, but selection is also valuable, and it might tell you a different story. What if this bear's home range shifted just a little bit? Availability is the same, but now this bear is using forest 40% of the time. Forest is 30% of what's available. Most of the time, that bear is not in the forest, but it's still selecting it because it's using it more than it's available, right? And what's happened to the field? It's using the field most of the time, but we can still say it's avoiding it. Because if it didn't give a shit where it was, it would be in that field 70% of the time. But it's there 60%. So it's making an effort to spend less time than it would if it just randomly wandered around. Make sense? Okay? And that's a useful story. It doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't mean that, oh, now that bear shifted its home range, you need to cut down, you need to grow forests wherever you have field. No. but those can help tell us the full story of the life history of the animal. Okay? And it's 10 till. I got one more slide, but I'm gonna save it for later. Okay, good. All right, y'all have a good day.